Once upon a time, there lived a man who got married to a calm and accomplished woman. His name was Chijuki, and his wife, Norma, was a highly respected mechanical engineer at an oil servicing firm in Lagos. Not many women ventured into engineering, but Norma shattered every stereotype with a quiet kind of power. Her intellect was sharper than a welding flame, and she earned admiration from all sides, not just for her work but for her brilliance. A first-class graduate from one of the nation's top universities, Norma's name often echoed in industry circles and corporate boardrooms. She was the type of woman whose silence commanded more respect than noise. She didn't boast, but every milestone clung to her like a medal of honor. When she married Chijuki, people whispered behind closed doors, she could have aimed higher, they said. Her husband had dropped out of Polytechnic after 2 failed semesters and spent most of his time lounging at home. No ambition. No passion. No vision. But he had a disarming charm, and more critically, he had perfected the subtle game of preying on successful women with soft hearts. He made it his life's mission to find a woman who would never threaten his delicate pride, one who would work endlessly, hand him her earnings, and stay loyal. Grateful even, that he chose her. Norma, sadly, checked all those boxes. She was 42 and deeply longing for marriage. Despite all she'd achieved, finding a man remained a battle. Her desperation often scared men off before they truly got to know her. At one point, she proposed to a man after only 1 date. She even went as far as buying a car for someone, hoping that would make him stay. Instead, he took the car, and married her maid, who worked in her house at the time. Norma was crushed. She couldn't wrap her head around how her own man chose her maid over her. The pain was a wild mix of shame, betrayal, and heartbreak. She had spent years buried in her career, earning a reputation that echoed through offshore platforms and engineering symposia. Yet, when it came to love, she felt like a never-ending disaster. The world applauded her intellect while some quietly mocked her loneliness. All her sisters were married, even the youngest, who was 15 years her junior. That wedding had shattered something inside her. She had danced and smiled as the proud big sister, but deep down, something broke. People found small, sharp ways to remind her of her single status. They asked sly questions and threw subtle jabs. "Ah, engineer with all the books but no husband," one person sneered once, suggesting that Norma was too selective, that maybe that's why she was still alone. Slowly, she began to wonder if they were right. Maybe love wasn't meant for women like her, women with full bank accounts and framed degrees on every wall. So when Chijuki showed up, he didn't even have to do much. He only did what others never did, he stayed. He listened, he smiled, and he said the words she'd longed to hear, that he told her she was different, that real men never feel threatened by a woman's success. That was all it took. Within a few months, Norma was swept up in a whirlwind romance. She introduced him proudly to her colleagues, paraded him before her family, and stood firm when they asked if she was truly sure about marrying him. Norma didn't care that he wasn't educated. She didn't mind that every wedding cost was covered with her own money. All Chijuki had to do that day was show up, and that was more than enough for her. Her family, especially her mother, watched with bittersweet joy. Deep inside, they knew this man wasn't worthy of the powerhouse woman he was about to marry. But while others worried, Norma rejoiced in finally being chosen. She smiled with a brightness in her eyes that only women who've waited too long could understand. It wasn't about finding perfection, it was about finally feeling seen. She wouldn't have to be pitted at weddings anymore. No more awkward silences when others spoke of their husbands. No more feeling like the odd one out in her own age bracket. So she celebrated. She danced with abandon. She glowed. But in her mother's heart, a storm raged silently. She had raised Norma to be a lioness, and now she watched her give herself to a fox dressed in borrowed feathers. At first, the marriage seemed perfect, tender, sweet, even ideal. Chijuki called her "my queen" every morning. He kissed her forehead, said grace over the meals she made, and told her how blessed he was to have her. But 3 months in, the cracks started to surface. Chijuki slowly turned Norma into his personal cash machine. He seized control of her finances, declaring that everything she owned now belonged to him too. He pressured her into transferring the house and vehicles into his name, threatening to walk away if she didn't. Norma gave in. She couldn't bear the thought of losing her marriage over mere material things. Despite all her education and exposure, Norma was ready to do anything to keep her husband. At 42, she saw Chijuki as a crown she didn't want to lose, the man who erased her shame by choosing her, even though she couldn't bear children. She felt indebted, and she wasn't about to let that go. She surrendered her salary, her voice, even her dignity, all to keep the marriage intact. She forgave every insult. She justified every slap. She blamed herself even when he cheated. One evening, Norma came home completely worn out. She had stopped by the salon earlier to change the hairstyle she had carried for almost 2 months. Walking into the living room, she found her husband sitting with his friends. After greeting them and making brief conversation, she quietly stepped away to go into the bedroom. Ojuku, one of Chijuki's friends, mocked him the moment she left. "So you let your wife make her hair without asking you first? Look at the length of those braids," he jeered. The room erupted in laughter. Chijuki sat there in silence, his ego stung by their teasing. "She looks like the man of the house, and you? You look like the wife," Ojuku said, as the others laughed even harder. Chijuki burned with silent fury. He had no job, no education, no standing among those men, just tolerance, because they knew his wife was the breadwinner. In that moment, he realized the only way to earn their respect was to assert dominance, even if it meant using her body to prove a point. When Norma stepped out moments later, Chijuki stood and called her to the center of the room. "Turn around," he said casually. Confused, she did as he asked. "Who gave you permission to do this hair?" he asked. She answered calmly, saying she didn't think she needed his approval for such things. Ojuku tried to suppress a chuckle, but the damage was already done. Chijuki, trying to save face, exploded. He shouted, and then, he struck her hard across the face. In a horrifying moment, he pulled out a lighter from his pocket and set her braids on fire. The flames caught instantly. Norma let out a scream that shook the walls. The room descended into chaos as the sharp stench of burning hair filled the air. She dropped to the floor, frantically trying to extinguish the fire. But the flames didn't stop immediately. Norma sprinted to the bathroom and emptied a full bucket of water over herself. Thankfully, the fire hadn't reached her scalp. She stood in front of the mirror, trembling, staring at the woman in the reflection. At that moment, everything came rushing back, her life, her worth, her story. She saw, finally and painfully, what she had become, a woman who traded her brilliance, her name, and her pride for the empty love of a man who burned her just to earn street credibility. And not one of his friends stepped in. They all sat motionless, watching her struggle for her life. In that instant, Norma knew, this had to end. She couldn't believe it. A woman once honored by men of stature now reduced to a joke by a man she had bent so low to love. A man with no job, no dreams, and no shame. She couldn't understand how she had allowed herself to endure such humiliation, all to save a marriage that gave her nothing but pain. A marriage where her loyalty was rewarded with infidelity. A marriage where her money paid every bill, and her husband reaped every benefit. And in return, she got nothing more than the title of Mrs. For years, she tiptoed through her own home, terrified of being alone. But now, looking at her broken reflection, she cried, not just from the burns on her body, but from the betrayal she allowed. In that moment, Norma woke up, not gently, but with force. Not slowly, but all at once. She stormed into the living room where Chijuki sat, laughing with his friends like nothing had happened. "Get out of my house. Now," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. They turned to look at her, and once again, they laughed. Chijuki stood with confidence, puffed up with arrogance. "If anyone's leaving, it's you," he sneered. "The house is in my name now." Norma stood in silence for a few seconds, then turned and walked away without a word. "She thinks just because I didn't go to school, I'm stupid," Chijuki boasted to his friends. They howled in agreement, praising his cleverness. But they all fell quiet when Norma walked back into the room, her presence heavy and unshakable. She stood tall in the center, holding up an envelope like a verdict. "This," she said, her tone like steel, "is the original house deed, bearing my full name, my initials, my lawyer's stamp, and my signature. Not yours, Chijuki." The room fell silent. Norma pulled out the document and raised it high so they could all see. "You thought I changed ownership to your name?" she asked, her eyes locked onto his frozen face. She explained clearly, her voice unshaken, that what he had signed was a document forfeiting all claims to her properties, every car, every asset, every brick of the house. "You thought you were clever," she said, stepping closer. Her gaze burned into him. "You thought you were smart." She repeated firmly, "No, Chijuki. I was the smart one." Her voice was cold, but calm, too calm. "The day you pressured me into handing over my assets, you unknowingly signed a legal disclaimer. That paper you signed without reading. My lawyer drafted it. And the moment your pen touched that page, you legally gave up any claim to everything I own." Chijuki shot to his feet, his rage bubbling over, but Norma didn't flinch. She spun around and flung the documents at him like daggers. "Read it," she said. Then paused. "Oh wait, you can't. You never learned how." The air thickened. Ojuku and the others looked on in stunned silence. The laughter in their eyes was gone, now replaced with something new, pity. The man they once mocked Norma for marrying had become the object of their sympathy. "The house," she continued. "Mine. The cars. Mine. Every account you've been leeching off. Frozen. My bank manager handled it just minutes ago." She took a breath, her voice unwavering. "As I speak, divorce papers are on their way to your mother's place, since you still list that as your official address." You can't do this to me," he stammered, fear creeping into his voice for the first time. "Oh, but I already have," Norma said, her eyes piercing through him. Then she dropped the final bomb. "I know everything, Chijuki. About your wife in the village. About your 2 children. The lies. The scam. You thought you could fool me and vanish after draining me dry?" It all made sense now, the late-night calls, the hidden messages. It all began one night when she noticed a strange text while he was sleeping. It was from a contact saved as "church sister," but the message read, "The kids miss you. When are you coming home?" That was her wake-up call. She hired a private investigator the very next day. And within a week, she had proof, photos, documents, even baptism certificates of the 2 children, one 3, the other 6. He wasn't just a liar. He was a repeat offender. A con artist. He had done this before, abandoned his first wife in the village with promises of work in Lagos, only to disappear and prey on someone new. Norma pulled the printed photos from an envelope and tossed them at him one by one, like courtroom evidence. "Tell them," she demanded, voice steady. "Tell your friends who you really are. Tell them how you played me, just like you did your wife back home." The room went dead silent. Even Ojuku, once the loudest voice in the room, now mumbled something under his breath as he made for the door. One by one, they followed, scattering like mice, unwilling to share in Chijuki's shame now that the truth had surfaced. And there he stood, utterly defeated, shoulders sunken, face ghostly pale, stripped of the only illusion of power he ever had. But Unma wasn't finished. She calmly picked up her phone and dialed a number. "Yes, officer," she said. "He's ready." Exactly 10 minutes later, police officers showed up at the door. Chijuki had not only unknowingly signed away his rights, Norma's legal team had also compiled enough evidence to have him arrested on charges of financial manipulation, identity fraud, and bigamy. As the officers cuffed him, he shouted, "You can't do this to me, I'm your husband." But Norma stood tall in the doorway, her voice as sharp as steel. "No, Chijuki," she replied coolly. "You were an assignment. And your deadline just expired." And with that, they dragged him out of the house. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply turned away, walked back inside, and closed the door. Not just the physical door, but every internal one that had ever let in shame, desperation, and the twisted belief that love meant enduring pain. That night, Norma sat alone in her bedroom, surrounded by silence, the healing kind. She picked up her phone again, this time to call her mother. "Mama," she said softly. "I'm coming home tomorrow. I need rest." Her mother, who had prayed endlessly for this moment, welcomed her back with open arms. She wept, not out of sadness, but because she could finally hear her daughter's true voice again. In the quiet of that night, Norma breathed deeply. Her scalp still burned. Her heart still throbbed. But deep inside her, something had shifted, something had healed. She stood before her mirror once more, and this time, she smiled. Not because the pain had vanished, but because she had finally remembered who she was, a lioness, never meant to kneel before a jackal. A woman who had rediscovered her voice through fire. From that day forward, Norma refused to let society's pressure dictate her worth. She no longer defined her value by the presence, or absence, of a man. She no longer dimmed her light to make others comfortable. Her scars became badges of survival, her brilliance no longer hidden. And she knew that one day, a man would come who loved her, not for what she could give, but for who she truly was. Until then, she was enough. Whole. Powerful. Because the true lesson is this. No woman should trade her dignity for a title. Marriage should never cost you your peace, your name, or your safety. No matter how late love arrives, it should never ask you to settle. A successful woman is never too much. She simply needs someone who is not too little. And in the end, it's always better to be alone and whole than married and shattered. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Thank you for watching.